Hey, this is Jonathan from SyniteAudio, and today I'll be showing you one of my favorite modulation sources, processors, block for Reaktor 6 called Decim-8. So what this does is it takes a floating point input, aka a signal that goes from -1 to +1 and anywhere in between, and outputs 8 modulation signals based on the decimal places of that input signal. So looking at the base controls, we've got the offset control, we've got a slew knob, and we have a level control. Now the level control works as an attenuverter, so not only does it work as a level control for the actual modulation signal output, but it also can invert it if you go from a negative to positive polarity, since it's bipolar. So let's go into our horizontal view. We're going to hook up our bento box LFO, in this case, because we can do a lot with this single LFO, into our input. We can also see there's a bunch of CV inputs, but you can just ignore that for now. I'm going to take the X1, or the first decimal place of the input signal, and run that through our scope here. Let's close that. Okay, so what we got here is, let's make a really slow LFO of, let's say, 0.1 hertz. So what this does, right now we're feeding our Decim-8 a sine signal from the LFO running at 0.1 hertz, going from a positive to a negative polarity. Actually, I'm going to go, that's a little slow. Let's do 1 hertz, or 1 hertz. There we go. Okay, so on the bento box LFO, we can see this little lamp flashing. Blue is negative and red is positive. So we're running that into Decim-8, and we're going to increase the level of the first decimal point to a positive fashion. Now, Decim-8, all of the outputs of this are also related in terms of polarity from the input. So if we're feeding the input, if we're giving it a negative signal, all of the outputs of Decim-8 will be negative. If we're giving it a positive signal, all of the outputs would be positive. However, that is also changeable from the offset and the level control. So if you turn the level control in a clockwise fashion, then the output will follow the polarity of the input. If you turn the level control to a counterclockwise fashion, then the output of Decim-8 will, or in this case of that decimal point, will be opposite of the input in terms of polarity. So we'll, in this case, bring our level control positive, and right off the bat we can see that this does some pretty gnarly stuff. So I wanted to exemplify this so we can slow down the LFO and we can start to make sense as to what's happening here. So let's go pretty slow. So as we bring it down, we're starting to show that Decim-8's outputs are ramps. So what this does is, even though we're feeding it a sine input, we're getting a ramp output because it's going from, it's just counting linearly in the decimal fashion. And we can also see that at one point, once it starts flipping polarity, then it slowly goes into a, you get a sort of sine transition, which is the top of the sine. So it's here, it's slowing down, and then we're getting a ramp, we're getting our sine flip. Then there's a small blip where it switches polarity and starts going in an opposite fashion. So what's going on here is, if we really slow it down, so our signal, our input signal, the bento box oscillator, is oscillating from -1 to +1. However, the first decimal place, in this case for Decim-8, is going to be going from -0.9 to, actually -0.9 to +0.9, also crossing 0. So it doesn't actually hit 1 itself, because if the input signal was 1, then the decimal point would be 0. So there's a bit of math involved in this, but I always see Decim-8 as a really cool way of getting a ton of modulation outputs that are still correlated to an input signal. So if I for example, transfer or change my LFO wave shape to a random signal, as you probably would, then every time the LFO ticks, it will send a random -1 to +1 value into Decim-8, which will set or offset all of the decimal points to have a value of its own. So if I put this up a bit, say around 1 Hz. There we go. Yeah, so you can see every time that that ticks, we can see the phase relationship, so it's slightly positive. It's going more positive, negative. So that also relates to that. And you can do neat things in Decim-8 to alter and or make more use of just the input that you're given. So going from the left to the right, we've got our offset control. So even though we're going in a positive fashion here, we can actually go and do negative offset. So what this does is a static value. It doesn't necessarily change. It's just a constant value. It doesn't change the actual polarity in terms of like, oh, it's like flipping a phase button. It doesn't do that. It just adds a constant offset value to whatever it is that's currently be done. So you can do some small offsets for each decimal point, or so like its own modulation. It's like its own little modulation channel. So you can give it a DC signal, and we can do a positive offset. So doing a positive offset, whenever it's positive, it will be more positive, and when it's negative, it'll actually decrease the amount of negative that there could be because of that. Moving on, we've got our Slew Control right next to that. So this can go from 0 all the way up to 60 seconds. So you can have up to 1 minute of slew time if you're feeding it really, really slow random signals, and you want like this specific decimal point or the specific channel, so channel 1 of that signal to be slewed. So you can use that for very slow modulation. So if we increase the clock rate a little bit of that random signal, we can start to increase this slew, and you'll see the output is slowly being ramped. So this should be done linearly. So linear slew, and then we're moving up. There you go. So you're starting to get into that smoothing territory. It's still less than a second. It's about 400 milliseconds. We can really go up to like actual 60 seconds. If you're feeding it a lot of like quick modulation, it'll filter all of that out, so you'll get closer and closer to 0 or wherever it is that the average of all the random modulation is. So we can bring this down back to a visible range. I'm actually going to increase this so we have more graph space to look at. All right, yeah, see, as we're slowing that, getting more and more linear interpolation between these steps. We can bring it back down. And all of these are actually modulatable, my bad. And that's what the CV inputs are for. So you can run 2 Decim-8s and have each Decim-8 modulate the other one. You can have some really cool stuff off of that. I've actually taken this before. I've had a random LFO going into one of my Decim-8s and then taken like the 8th output or the 8th decimal point, running that into another Decim-8. So I've got like chained modulation sources based off of the decimal points of the one input, and then everything's like still polarity based off of the original input, so it's still like sort of synced in some way. It's like you're getting randomization in to a degree where it's like very minute, but in this case Decim-8 exemplifies those sources of randomization. However, they're still linked to an input, so you can still get some sort of organic sense out of random values, which is pretty interesting, especially when you're running it like oscillators or whatever it is you want. So this is just our 1. Now it's always fun to bring in more, so we can do that all the way up to the 8th here. 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we really get to see, when we're running in a randomly stepped input, the amount of variation from all of the 8 decimal points. So as you can see, they're all running in the same color range, and that's because, as I said, numerous times are linked to the original polarity of the input. However, this is where you can do some cool stuff. So you can have like the first 4 follow and then the second 4 be flipped from that. So every time the input signal goes high, the output of these decimal points will be low, vice versa. And you can actually do some really cool stuff. Like I've had, like you can run also an input into Decim-8, let's say a random white noise source that's clocked every I don't know, 8th step of like a sequencer or something, and then you can take those outputs and run them into modulating drum signals, modulating drum blocks, synth blocks, everything you want. It's really versatile modulation source, and our modulation processor. It is a source, not necessarily because the source is the input that you feed it. So if you're running an input of 0, if I literally disconnect this, you get nothing. You could run an offset, so you can have somewhat of an offset, but this offset is just 0.5. It's half of a full swing that any one of these decimals can actually output. So you could still give it a just turn the level up and then modulate the offsets, and you'll have sort of a modulation source. So if even though I have, for example, 1 here is set to 100, we don't have an input, so it's set to 0, which is off. But if you run the offset, you can actually create. So you can draw in offsets with another LFO. I'll actually show that off right now. So if I turn all of these guys off, so let's turn off all the offsets, levels, except for the first decimal point. I'm going to run a random signal. So my randomly stepped going at about 2 Hertz into our input. So now we're getting our random inputs. I'm going to then take this LFO, duplicate it. So this one's right here. Let's put that on this side of Decim-8, and we're going to give that randomly stepped, and then this should be shaped as smoothing, I think. Random exponential linear smoothing. Okay, clockwise. So we're going to give it linear smoothing, running at, let's say, a little faster, so 3 Hertz. I'm going to take this output, and we're bringing it into channel 1, or X1 offset. So we're going to go take the output of that bento box, go to X1 offset CV, right here, and we're going to hit our CV, and we're going to bring that up, and now we're getting even more modulation on our inputs. That can be swung around. We can even make this go faster. Do exponential smoothing. Linear. Actually, I think I like the linear smoothing a little bit better. Yeah, so you can leave your offset right in the middle, and then you can have another LFO determine what's going on with that offset. You can also have that same LFO determine slew time. So if I bring this up a bit, this will control some slew. This is bipolar, so I have to take into account the swing range. But yeah, look at that. Now you're getting even more interesting modulation inputs, or outputs, from 2 modulation source inputs who got their actual input into Decim-8 and the CV inputs from the other bento box. And that's just one channel. So you can start to see how this really starts to stack up. Now if we're running this into an oscillator, for example, so let's go bento box, let's do an oscillator, and let's do a bass pitch of, let's say, 0.5, which should be middle C, and we'll take our modulation source, go into mod A, and take the output of our bento box, go into the scope input as well as our pitch, so it tracks it. So now we got a sine. We have our mod. Actually, let's not do mod A. Let's run this into the FM input, because we're getting some decent modulation. We can actually start ramping up our FM value. Let's do linear through Z. That's giving us some interesting stuff. Let's see if we can actually listen to that. Let's get a simple VCA. I'm not going to do an envelope or a note in because I'm not going to be playing this. I just want to hear the outputs. So we'll just run that through here. Bring this up a little bit. It's pretty cool, actually. So you can imagine if you're playing this, you got the source of random modulation source. Source of randomization in terms of two LFOs playing with each other. Invert, more FM. Oh, after a certain point the linear just cuts. Interesting. Oh, I'll keep it through Z. Through Z is very stable. You can increase the input into Decim-8. That's so cool. You can also do, let's say the second one will go into mod A, and we'll feed that into the shape value. So let's start bringing up 2. Oh, that's so trippy. Give it a little bit of slew. Anyways, this has been a nice tips and tutorials on Decim-8, a modulation source, modulation processor, but most importantly, modulation block for Reaktor 6. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I'll definitely be posting more, and thank you for watching.